Okay, next up, we are going to have our first panel of the day. This panel is titled Open versus Closed AI, and it brings with it Mark Rydon, co-founder of Aether. Sewoong Oh is a core contributor at Sentient and a professor of computer science at the University of Washington. We have Saneel Sreeni, who is a founding member of Ritual, Matthew Wang, co-founder of Valence, and moderating this panel, is Anand Iyer. He's founder of Canonical Crypto and a venture partner at Lightspeed. Let's welcome them to the stage.
We've got a nice crowd here. I like this. Oh, are we missing a mic? You guys want to? I can also pass this down if needed. All right, sick. Excited to kick this off. Thanks for, first of all, thanks to the team for having us here. Let's just blaze through. We'll do some quick backgrounds just to level set your experience. The theme is to talk about open versus closed. But let's just kick it off with a quick round of intros, backgrounds, and my ask is like, I was telling backstage, and maybe something punchy, something that's like, I know you just got off the plane, by the way, but something that's like top of mind for you as it pertains to this panel. But how about this? We'll start with you, and then we'll work it out, because this guy just literally got off the plane. But Sewoong, you want to kick it off with some intros? And
Sure. Hi. I wear two hats here. One is I'm a professor of computer science at Allen School at University of Washington, and the other hat is I'm directing research of AI at Sentient. So I am interested in open source in many ways. One thing I want to kind of point out is we are running a huge open source data set competition at UW. We run several rounds of it now, and it's been very exciting research direction to provide data sets that can achieve the closed and black box models that big techs have with the data set that can achieve these performances. And that's been, I think, most exciting part recently in open source for us.
Cool. Thank you.
Awesome. I'm Matthew. I'm the co-founder of Valence. And my personal background is a little bit of in HCI research, ML research. Spent some time doing small stints at big tech companies like Google and Facebook. Most of my professional career was doing research engineering at a quantitative hedge fund called 2 Sigma, where I worked on the quantitative modeling side, research engineering side for an equity options desk. And at Valence today, we spent a lot of time thinking about how to bring more of the world's compute on chain in the form of model-driven workloads and compute. How to bring kind of functions that help people run model-driven compute workloads, like simple regression, analysis, interpolation, all this stuff on chain to help empower the existing state of Web3 compute.
I've got my own now.
Okay, awesome.
So Mark here, co-founder of Aether. At Aether, we build decentralized GPU infrastructure for AI and gaming companies. The big focus for us is enterprise-grade GPU infrastructure. So everything that's committed to Aether's infrastructure, all kind of 43,000 GPUs, are enterprise-grade. They're sitting in data centers or connected to enterprise-grade network infrastructure, all kind of perfectly suited and built for enterprise-grade kind of workloads from an AI perspective, or we also do a lot in the kind of cloud gaming and cloud publishing side. My background's in infrastructure building. I've kind of started in the oil and gas and power space, building large infrastructure projects before transitioning into cloud infrastructure, which kind of led me to where I am today.
Hi everyone, I'm Saneel. I am not Niraj, the founder of Ritual, but I am a founding member at Ritual. Ritual is aiming to bring models on-chain in a way that's accessible to developers across the world. So we have two phases, one of which is live and complete, which is sort of the first network AI Oracle network of its kind that allows developers to access use smart contracts to access models on-chain. And we're now heading into our phase 2, which is the Ritual chain, which will be its own sort of sovereign layer that adds a bunch of functionality to an EVM-compatible VM that will allow you to essentially use models atomically, right? So, Matthew mentioned a lot about, regression models. So anything from like classical supervised learning models to, LLMs and things that are more savoir-faire today. to build applications around them. And the goal is to allow anyone to write smart contracts over models in the same way that Ethereum allowed people to write smart contracts over this, sort of shared state machine. My background is a mix of crypto and AI. I previously was on the founding team of a DeFi protocol, and I've been on the investment teams over at Dragonfly and Polychain, along with the investment team at Accomplice as well. But before that, I was actually doing a bit of ML research over at Berkeley, as well as doing ML at Lineage Logistics, which I don't expect anyone to heard of. But if you ever had anything refrigerated in North America, it went through their warehouses. So I was in charge of writing algorithms to make sure they got places very quickly.
Cool, thank you. All right, I have some questions here, but if anyone else has questions for this panel, please get it ready. We can improv a little bit and go to the audience. But to start off with, I'd love to understand from you folks, what is it that we think is necessary for open source AI to really dominate and for this to become sort of first nature for us, right? What are the barriers that exist today? What is the current landscape as it stands right now? And maybe the second bullet point here is also, how do you think about open source? Because it's like this, the way we think about open source when it comes to code is one thing. When it comes to models, weights, it's a different story altogether. So yeah, just in terms of how do you look at the landscape, and what do you think are the barriers for us to for adoption of open source AI across the board? Is it okay if I start with you, Saneel?
Sure. Yeah. I think that the question of adoption of open source and how I think about open source goes sort of hand in hand, right? At the end of the day, I think models are fairly, in themselves as units, right, are not necessarily fungible, but we currently see that the state of the art is consistently dominated by a few players that generally are closed source or tending towards closed source. I mean, even Meta was okay, we're not going to make our models free forever, right? But it is the case that whenever an open source model comes out, some lab or some hacker out there is pretty good at either, or a closed source model comes out, is pretty good at distilling something that gets a pretty decent functionality. Which is all to say that ultimately the only really good way to disseminate all of this is the end utility to builders, right? So if there's a combination of a model being cheap enough to run, or customizable enough in certain cases, right? There's a lot of consumer cases that want to take open source models and fine-tune them for their own needs. But if there's a case of a model being cheap enough to run and good enough for the use cases, I think that any marginal addition or any marginal improvement in things like perplexity or whatnot, right, doesn't matter to the end consumer. So when asking how does open source win or how does it compete with closed source, I think it really just comes down to those three dimensions, right? If you can make them cheap, run good enough for the task that's willing to do, right? Most use cases are never going to touch, most consumer use cases especially are never going to touch the complete upper bound of what OpenAI's GPT-4o can do, even though it is very, very powerful, but people definitely default to it because it's cheap to run. But there's plenty of distilled or models that are good at running on more constrained devices for cheaper that can do most of what a AI companion chatbot would need to do, right, for example. And then the question of open source is really, really interesting because, within open source itself, within software, we've seen a trend towards BSC3 licensing, right? This code is open source, but if you want to use it, you better give me something, otherwise, I have grounds to. With AI, it's much harder because, you can go and maybe trademark or whatever patent weights, right? License model weights, but you can also just slightly tweak the model weights and say that they're different, right? So I think that there definitely needs to be a big push for, I think, fundamental research around watermarking. There's a few schemas already, but I don't think they really deal well with non-determinism in models, or how do you account for minute differences that still yield differences in outputs, but are basically the same model at the end of the day. That's a really big unsolved problem. I think that'll be really, really important for unlocking the ability to monetize open source using crypto rails.
Yeah, that's a great take. And I'm going to maybe zoom out a little bit, right? I think for open source AI to win, right, I think there needs to be a recognition that open source AI is a pretty fragile space, right, in general, right? You've got, Open AI started as a not-for-profit, earned a little bit of money, and now they're not open anymore. You've got Mistral, for example, right? They open source their smaller models, but Mistral Large, they don't release. You have an entire ecosystem right, within the Open AI space that's largely built on the release of Meta's latest model, right? If they pull out of that open source kind of ideology, right, I'd imagine the whole space would be set back, quite considerably. So I think that, to be honest, the open source AI sector is really heavily reliant on a very small and very fragile set of contingencies, and that, to be honest, needs to be heavily addressed for us to ever get to a point where I think that that open AI or open source AI can compete long term.
Can I, just to piggyback off that, and I wanted to ask you both this, which is closed source, OpenAI and others. I mean, OpenAI has been in the works for a long time, but these models like that are closed source in nature have moved really fast, right? So if you just look at, again, to zoom out, look at the progression of like closed source versus open source, right? You look at Microsoft versus Linux, you look at iOS versus Android. It feels like the polish comes with closed source. Open source lags a little bit. How do you think about that when it comes to utility and things of that nature, Matt?
Yeah, so I think right now, times have really changed a ton, and things have rapidly advanced, especially in the AI sector, right? When Stable Diffusion first initially was open sourced, it was very different because they essentially were operating under the idea of, hey, we're going to put out this open source model, and people are going to try it out. They're going to deploy on-prem, and once enterprises realize, hey, I actually want this model to be productionalized in some way, shape, or form in some kind of service, then they would contact Stability AI and have them essentially in a consulting capacity to build this for them. But now today, there are so many kind of tools and services and open source software that people can leverage to kind of fine tune and deploy these AI models. So I think that becomes the kind of tool that the open source AI models are closely integrating with, where you now, instead of having, with closed source, you could just directly make an API call, but with open source, you now have access to, the transparency around the weights, and you have all these tools that you can use to fine tune the model. Becomes this kind of ability to allow open source to compete and slowly catch up with a lot of these closed source solutions. And I wanted to build on a bit on what Saneel had said about kind of watermarking as a way for security for models, as an example, or for IP, right? I think the people at Meta put out a great paper on what they call stable signatures, which is essentially this technology that you would embed in a decoder for a diffusion model that would essentially would embed some cryptographic signature into the image it generates that's completely naked to the human eye but is algorithmically detectable. And the kind of nice thing about that is we are now able to run simple algos that can detect, hey, was this content generated by AI or was it generated by a camera or some human? And that introduces some degree of safety and transparency to the world where people are generating tons of fake content. But now I think just to play devil's advocate a little bit, if you open source these types of models, people can suddenly hot swap the decoder and be able to kind of remove the component that embeds these signatures. So I definitely think it's a careful balancing game when we think about open source versus closed source, where it's a series of trade-offs today, where with closed source you have these huge enterprises that are willing to kind of support you and also can embed technologies such as the signatures. But with open source you have a high degree of composability, but kind of less guarantees around safety, albeit with more transparency.
What do you think? You straddle sort of both worlds in some ways. And
Yeah, I think I agree with Matt quite a bit. So I think he pointed out something nice, which is that the landscape or ecosystem of AI is quite different from other examples that you mentioned. It's moving so fast that there's room for everyone to contribute. For example, we ran open source projects on clip models, which is multimodal models between image and text. And OpenAI came up with their clip model, which is completely hidden everything. And we were able to just try to match their performance. That was our goal initially, collecting data, filtering data, and coming up with simple training schemes, but mostly innovating on the data filtration to aim to match their performance. In the end, the open source project we ran ended up performing better significantly than the original claim model. So it's an ongoing conversation between open world and the closed world, trying to beat each other, but in the process, innovation comes up, and I think there's room for both worlds to help each other be better.
I just wanted to, just one sort of follow-up question there, because I think some of the chatter that exists today is that a lot of folks who put, let's take Anthropic, Mistral, Open AI, with their models, I feel like sometimes they like to parade the performance of their models relative to some benchmarks they really care about, right? So it looks really good. So when you say they perform well, can you elaborate? Can you zoom in on that a little bit more?
Right. So this was these models are typically evaluated on ImageNet with 0-shot accuracy.
Sure.
So that's the kind of the performance you care about. And then if you want to add another axis, you do it on distribution shifted versions of ImageNet and look at the robustness. So those are the two axes that we care about. Performance-wise, ImageNet mainly, just because it's what everyone uses, but 0-shot. And then there's a robustness metric. So in both, we are interested in, and in the ImageNet performance, I don't know the numbers top of my head, it's been a year, but we beat with the open source model, the original model that they came up with from Open AI.
Thank you. Yeah, it's helpful. I wanted to switch a little bit because you folks have incredible backgrounds. You've been thinking about the problem space probably a lot longer than some of us have. And maybe Mark, I'll start with you. Having spent time building Aether, like what are some earned secrets? What are things that you have learned along the way as it pertains to, specifically with open and closed source, with scaling, with GPUs, things that, if you had to tell someone else, like if you had to go back and talk to Mark from a year ago, like what are some things that you've learned that have been helpful to you, or mistakes or pitfalls that you want others to avoid?
I think in general, AI benefits so much from centralization, right? Centralization of resources, centralization of capital, centralization of compute or data sets. So I think building anything truly decentralized in AI is like a challenging take. In compute, in some ways more challenging, right? Co-location of GPUs is critical, right? How do you solve the co-location problem when you're building from decentralized compute infrastructure? So I think we did the right thing early on, focusing on enterprise-grade compute. I think there's a definite long-term advantage or long-term potential in unlocking the latent compute that exists on the edge, that exists in kind of consumer compute. But I don't think that's a problem that I hope someone else solves, right? Not necessarily Aether, and I'm glad that we didn't choose to solve that problem. I think what I would have probably encouraged myself and the team to focus on earlier was, okay, if we're building enterprise-grade compute, right, we're obviously limiting the type of participant that can engage with our ecosystem as a hardware provider, right? And one of the great benefits of DePIN, right, is that you onboard community that are really intrinsically motivated to have your network succeed, right? Because they're contributing hardware and they earn as a result of that contribution. So it took us quite a while to kind of solve that challenge. We ended up solving it with this checker role that we established within our network. It's essentially the police force of the network. It's like a validator on steroids, and it doesn't necessarily require someone to have a high amount of compute power. It doesn't require them to have an enterprise-grade GPU infrastructure. But what it did was allow us to kind of decentralize a critical role within our network and give more access to the community to kind of participate and contribute valuable work within our ecosystem. So I think for us, recognizing that despite the fact that we were really motivated to contribute to this kind of decentralized AI ethos, but also recognizing that early on, some of those advantages will come from kind of some form of centralization, but still focusing on what areas of the business that we can control, where decentralization does make sense without kind of just hamstringing the business as a whole.
So progressively decentralized, focus on something that works, and then build decentralization on top. Saneel, what about you? Any earned secrets?
Yeah.
You've been an investor as well, so you've seen,
Yeah. It's been an interesting. Yeah, we've co-invested in a ton of stuff. It's been an interesting thing seeing this both as an operator and investor. But I'll say this. I think what you said hit the mark around that. But so if you're trying to be creative, more closer to the model layer, right, versus the compute layer, what you're going to notice is that there are still a vast majority of markets that are not suitably targeted by current closed source providers, and not because the models themselves are not, well, in some cases, the models themselves are not performant to a certain degree, but because there are restrictions. And I think crypto as an industry grew out of basically creating systems that circumvented restrictions, both good and sometimes bad. And I think the same definitely goes for AI. So I'll give you a worked example. We work a lot with, for example, consumer-focused AI companies that are building things around like chatbots and personas and creating really interesting semantics around how you can own them. A lot of these have grown to several 100,000 users. They're processing millions of inference requests over our software a day, and a lot of them are very profitable. We're doing millions in revenue. And it's like, okay, how can these exist? Why don't people just go to OpenAI, et cetera? As it turns out, a lot of these take advantage of basically taking open source models and going ahead and fine-tuning them to do things around uncensored outputs or adopting personalities that you just wouldn't get out of like a US closed source company. There's a few other companies that are very interested in using open source because they're literally just blocked by cross-border payments from accessing OpenAI API, right? You can only pay in US dollars. If your bank doesn't support US dollars and you can't pay for that, you're kind of screwed. And so I think focusing on basically where people fall out at the margins of the current system has been very, very interesting, and I think it's something that people should pay a lot more attention to, where in order for it to get adoption, you need to find the communities that are already incentivized to use it, right? Because they're structurally barred out from existing systems, and go after them. When it grows to a certain scale, and these are by no means small. When I say margin, this is such a massive industry, and I dare say the number, right now, the number of people that are using closed source models probably are way higher than the number of people using open source, but that's because it's largely been constrained to, what I would quote, the very high-tech world of the East and West. Even in the East, I think a lot of them still do try and go use open source models if they can't get access to OpenAI. That's where we've been spending a lot of time, and we've been seeing that grow a lot. And I think that as that gets recognition, people start realizing that there is actually utility in playing outside these closed source models. So for me, I think that's been something that's really interesting to observe and to learn and go after.
Thank you. Over to you, Matt. I'm curious, open source, I feel like there's this 2x2 somewhere, the open source versus closed source. And I'm just talking about let's talk about weights for now, right? And then there's centralization, decentralization. So I know we're talking a lot about open and closed here, but I guess maybe the theme of we're all sort of building on decentralized networks in some ways. What do you see as sort of the wedge or advantage here? Is it, Saneel was talking about the inability to access something like OpenAI because of rails that require USD, for example. But other inherent advantages that you can see with decentralization that becomes a part of our narrative to, I guess, cross the chasm for utility that's not limited to just crypto?
Yeah, so moving away from kind of the infrastructure and talking about what these models actually can do and the value they can deliver. So if you kind of take a look at TradFi as an example, and I'll get into how decentralization plays into this, but in the 1960s and 70s, when kind of computers became a thing, you really saw this explosion of kind of usage of compute and statistical analysis and machine learning in analyzing kind of expected returns, right? You had Alfred Winslow Jones start the first long short strategy in the 40s. You had Harry Markowitz with mean variance portfolio optimization, which became kind of the backbone of MPT today. You have Eugene Fama and Kenneth French doing research on how to model expected returns with multi-factor models, and obviously winning the Nobel Prize with the Fama-French model. And with that as an example, you saw all these other spin-outs of modeling primitives come out of this research, right? The Carhart 4-factor model, the Fama-French 5-factor model, all spun out from this. And kind of similarly, I'm expecting personally some kind of Cambrian explosion of modeling primitives for more Web3 native use cases. as like the infrastructure that we're all building here together kind of falls into place, right? Once you have decentralized compute, once you have reliable access to inference for these models and statistical kind of analysis and all these research tooling that allows people to build models and deploy them efficiently on chain, I think there's going to be a plethora of research on, hey, as an example, how can we create some shared primitive that denotes like some notion of risk for adjusting LTV ratios in a lending protocol, right? How can we use that to adjust, fees dynamically in AMM swaps to reduce impermanent loss? Or how can we use, machine learning models to optimize, like, inefficient DAO governance or assigned reputation scores to deepen validators? These are all like kind of extremely difficult and complex problems that exist today. And just because the infrastructure has yet to really exist, we don't have access to clean, structured, tabular data. We don't have access to reliable compute and inference that is both fast and scalable, but also secure and verifiable. Once these things fall into place, I'm very interested in kind of like seeing people kind of pioneer these areas of research. And obviously us involved, the team at Valence, we're very, very interested in kind of like driving a lot of this ourselves as well. And I think decentralization is going to be a major feature to this, where hey, anyone can in a censorship-resistant fashion upload any model to some file store or access any other model that someone else has uploaded, refit it on some new data, like fine-tune it, and that's how we achieve what we call research velocity, right? Where we have this, this centralized kind of group of researchers and mindshare developing a lot of these models, but we have all these other people around the globe being able to access it from anywhere, no matter who they are, and I think that's going to be very important in the next 3 to 5 years.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It sounds a lot like, you remember this, like when Const was talking about with BitTensor back in the day. So I think if I had to summarize, at least what I gather is that it's less about the use cases, but more about the ability for developers to tinker, because that is, with closed source systems and the lack of, because of centralization, that's really hard to do. So that's an awesome point. I know we're coming up on time here, but Sewoong, I wanted to quickly like segue from like the here and now to like what Matt was talking about, like looking into the future. What are you expecting will be maybe steady state, either when it comes to open versus closed, centralization versus decentralization, maybe from your perch, from your vantage point, like what can we expect in the next 6, 12, 18 months, even science fiction, let's look forward, even way past that as well, and then we'll make our way down the panel, and then if anyone else has questions, please get them ready, we'll try to hit them quickly, but yeah.
Sure. So, yeah, what we're thinking is that the decentralization is a blessing. The diversity that comes from it, like how YouTube and how TikTok is so powerful, is all the contributors that only can come through the platform. So in steady state, in sometime in the future, what we're hoping is that we solve at least one problem with the current ecosystem, which is right now, if you want to make name for yourself and be rewarded for the contributions you're making as one of the million people who are contributing to innovation of AI, then the rewards are very noisy and indirect. So, for example, if in academia, you'll have to spend countless time to come up with new tooling, new innovation, data set, or models, and submit to a conference where it'll be reviewed by 3 reviewers and wait for 3 months and then try to convince them. And then the conference happens, you go there with one of the thousands of papers. It's very indirect. So what we're hoping is that there will be transparent and direct reward system that will be giving the content providers and data set providers and model innovators the reward that they deserve. And that's going to foster ecosystem where diversity naturally shows up. So that's the stable state that we're hoping to achieve. And yeah, I'd like to hear from others on that too.
Awesome. And yeah, maybe, sorry, we may be running up on time. So yeah, would love your thoughts, Matt.
Yeah, so I think in the next, I'll try to make this quick, but in the next like 3 to 5 years, I think we're going to see kind of this explosion of like decentralization of not just infrastructure, but also of knowledge itself, right? Where these open source models will, as tools become better, we'll see many different flavors come online, all decentralized and open source, right? Where many people can create agents or LLMs of many different flavors that are catered to many specific types of use cases. So you can, go on some kind of sites and be able to see, hey, this is like a stable diffusion model that generates some specific type of art. This is an LLM designed, for doctors, and all these like specialized models will be able to be accessed by anyone. And I think that in and of itself is extremely powerful, and I'm very excited to see it come to fruition.
Yeah, I agree with that. I agree that there will be this Cambrian-style explosion of utility across the open source ecosystem. I think that's going to be really, really cool. Looking, maybe 5+ years down, I wonder whether AGI is more likely to appear from a centralized solution or a decentralized solution. My guess is probably centralized, so I wonder if open source really matters at all. But it's a interesting space for sure, and a lot of value to be extracted over the next and provide over the next 5 years.
Yeah, I'm gonna play devil's advocate here. I don't think AGI is a single model. I do think AGI generally will be, multi-models, multi-agentic, like swarms, where we don't have a human that's good at everything, right? And we've seen that even LLMs cannot outperform like simple regression models or things on tabular data. It's very clear that there are benefits to focusing model architectures on specific tasks, right? Or focusing the training of models on specific tasks to get speed ups. So maybe looking out forward, and I know we're at time, but maybe looking out a little bit forward. In the next 3 to 5 years, I do think that we will see a lot more specializations of models. People will ascribe a lot more importance to how we route to those models. I think that's something we didn't get to discuss here, but the idea of like being able to evaluate models' performance on a specific domains and routing users' requests, you don't think about how you get your search results when you go to Google, right? You just trust that PageRank works. You shouldn't have to think about which model to use for a specific domain task. There should be software that works there. And finally, all of that goes hand in hand with having the right incentives for open source AI. So I do think that we will also start seeing, largely through crypto, modes by which open source model creators can monetize even if they're not directly hosting their models. And I think that comes with a lot of fundamental research about being able to do provenance for models being yours. Once you have those three, you'll have a sort of like a closed loop system for making sure that open source models are actually profitable. There's an actual real need for open source models to be fine-tuned because it's expensive to fine-tune with OpenAI, and then have those coordinate in some way so that you have sort of this like swarm version of AGI.
Awesome. Well, thank you. I know we're at time, but hey, thank you guys so much for this. Like, it was really a pleasure and really grateful for you guys for sharing your thoughts here today. And for those of you who had questions, please find these amazing people afterwards. But yeah, please a round of applause for our panelists. Thank you again.
Yeah. Thanks, guys.